A huge thank you to patron Jaguar's Rule for suggesting today's video topic. If you want to suggest a topic for next Wednesday's Name Explain video, all you have to do is support Name Explain on Patreon for $1 a month. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/Name Explain, which will be linked down below. Anyway, the names of sports tend to fall into one of two categories. The names are either incredibly boring, with very obvious literal meanings, or they have pretty unique names which consist of a word that is only really used in the context of that sport within the English language. Sport names that fall into the former category include things like basketball, baseball, netball, and the various sports found across the globe which have been dubbed football, whereas sports that land in the latter category include ones like tennis, cricket, golf, dressage, hockey, and polo. When it came to making a video explaining the names of sports, the simple solution would be just a list of each sport in a row and give you their etymology. But you know what? That sounds boring and would honestly just be like reading a Wikipedia page or something. I'm feeling a tad more fun when it comes to this one. So instead of just explaining the names of these sports, I had a more silly idea. What if we could put every sport name into just one of these categories? While it would be easy to give every sport a more obvious name, like calling golf club ball, hockey ice puck, and tennis racket net and calling it a day, I fancied more of a challenge for myself. I wanted to see if we could instead come up with more creative, unique names for sports that have names a tad on the drier side. Why am I doing this instead of just making a generic sport names explained video that probably get more views? Well, simply because it's more fun. Something else I need to stress is that I'm not implying that these sports should change their name, or that the names I'm going to suggest are better than their current names. Baseball can be called baseball forever and I won't really be too bothered. This video is just my way of talking about the names of these sports without mindlessly rattling through them, because as mentioned, that sounds really boring to me. So how exactly am I going to concoct these new names for sports? Well, I'm not going to simply pull them out of thin air or type random letters into a keyboard. Don't worry, football isn't going to be called or something like that anytime soon. I'm going to give these sports new names that will make logical sense from an etymological perspective. I have done this by looking into the etymology of more uniquely named sports and applying their etymological root to sports with more dull names. From looking for a list of the world's most popular sports and checking the origins of the ones on that list with less obvious names, I realised that most of these sports have names that come from one of three roots. The first of those roots being sports named after key equipment used in them. This actually makes them quite obvious boring names too, but the names come from languages other than English, which makes them seem more exotic to us English speakers. Cricket, an example, most likely comes from the old French croquet, which means goalpost or stick. Golf, meanwhile, probably derives from the Middle Dutch kolf, meaning club or bat. Hockey comes from the old word of hockey, meaning crook or shepherd's staff, in relation to the shape of a hockey stick. Polo comes from the Tibetan poulou, their word for ball, and lacrosse comes from the French-Canadian jeu de la clouse, meaning the game of the hooked stick. The second popular etymology route for these sports names is by having them named after a key action or verb which relates to the sport. Tennis, in example, comes from the Anglo-French tenets, which means hold, receive, take. This was called from a player serving to the opponent. Boxing's name comes from an old word for a blow or a strike, a box. Where this ultimately comes from, however, we don't seem to know. And we don't know if it relates to the cube thing made of cardboard either. Dressage's name comes from an old verb of dress, which means to straighten out, which relates to the straight lines and movements horses make during this sport. And sumo simply comes from a Japanese word meaning to compete. The third route for the origin of these sports names isn't as popular, but it's still worth highlighting. That being sports named after where they were created/popularized. There's actually only two I could find that fit this criteria: rugby and badminton. Rugby is named after Rugby, a town in the UK. It was named after this town because the rules of the modern sport were popularised in the town, specifically one of the schools there. Badminton is named after Badminton House, a fancy estate in Gloucestershire, once again here in the UK. Now, if you were just here to find out how oddly named sports got their names, well, there you go, you can leave now if you want to. But this is where the true fun actually begins. Through these roots of sports being named after either equipment, an action, or where they came from, we can start to give more fun, unique names to sports that don't have the most thrilling of names. While I will mainly be sticking to these three roots, I might throw some other ideas in there for good measure too. We will also be looking to the history of these sports too, seeing if we can form names from languages of their past, which may sound more exotic to us English speakers. That brings us neatly to the first sport I want to highlight: basketball. Basketball is obviously named that because the aim of the game is to get the ball in the basket. Suffice to say, the game could do with a rebrand in regards to its name. In looking for a new name for basketball, I went down the route of looking at where the sport was created. While people have been throwing balls into things in the air for quite some time now, basketball in its current form seems to have originated from Springfield College in Massachusetts. It was invented by an instructor at the college named James Naismith in 1891. With that in mind, my genuine suggestion for the new name for basketball is Springfield. It ties in nicely with where the sport originated and fits in line with sports like rugby and badminton. What I especially like about the idea of basketball being called Springfield is that the spring part of the name could relate to the springiness of the players who make the shots. Is this silly? Yes, but please remember, that's the whole point of this video. And while it might sound weird to suddenly be calling basketball Springfield, it wouldn't seem too odd if this was the name from the outset. If that were the case, it's the only name we would know for the sport, and a name like basketball would instead sound really weird and literal. A sport with deep ties to basketball is netball. This game is mainly popular in countries with ties to the British Empire, so I'm not sure how well known of it is in places like the USA or even other parts of Europe. Netball began life as a modified version of basketball, originating a few years after in 1897 in the UK. It was actually created by an American teacher in the UK at a college in Dartford called Madame Austenberg's College. Austenberg is a terrific sounding word unto itself, so I'd be more than happy with netball being called this, or even just being called Dartford would be fun, referencing players darting around the court. The name of Austenberg comes from one Martina Bergman Austenberg, an advocate for women's suffrage and someone who played a large role in getting more women into sport. She alone sounds like an awesome person for a sport to be named after. Volleyball is an odd one. In my eyes, the name kind of sits between obvious and interesting. It's obvious because the sport literally just involves volleying a ball, but it's unique as the word of volley is only really used in the realm of sports, especially with this one. So my suggestion for a name change is to simply rename it as just volley. Name it after the action like many other sports and ditch the ball part so it doesn't end up being rounded up with all the other ball named sports. Volleyball has its roots in the USA in the 19th century, so it's not even like we can look into another language's word for volley to make it more interesting or anything. We can however do that with handball. Handball is a sport with really old roots. Games similar to handball can be found as far back as ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Due to this, I wanted to find a cool Latin word to use as the sport's name, and I came across the word of iucio. This is the Latin word for throwing. Not only is it cool and unique sounding, but it reflects one of the key actions of the sport, the throwing of the ball. Come on, who wouldn't be down for a game of iucio or two? Then we arrive at baseball. For this one, I've decided that a far superior name for the sport would be knuppel. Now, bear with me on this one. That is not a random word I just made up. That is instead the Dutch word for bat, as in the thing you hit a ball with, not the flying mammal thing. At least I'm 99% sure that's the case. If knuppel is in fact the Dutch word for the animal kind of bat, then please let me know, and sorry about that. So for this sport, I've gone with the route of naming after one of the main pieces of equipment used in the sport. But why the Dutch word for it? Well, this of course all has to do with the origin of the sport. Baseball is one of the most definitively American sports out there. It's believed to have its roots in the city of New York in the early 1800s. A group of people known as the Knickerbocker Baseball Club are seen as the first team to really get the ball rolling on the sport, laying out many of the rules and even playing in the first official game of baseball. This is why I went with the Dutch word for bat. New York has a long history with the Dutch, and the team are called the Knickerbockers. This is a term that has been deeply tied with the Dutch rule of New York in the past. This is why I suggested that baseball should simply be called knuppel instead. Also, the Dutch word for baseball is honkball, so maybe we should just go with that instead. Another sport very much linked with the USA is bowling, and bowling, while not having ball in its name, is very literally named. It's just named after the fact you bowl the ball. Something I didn't know is that Christian reformer Martin Luther was actually pivotal in the formation of modern bowling. Seriously, there was little that guy couldn't do, so just Luther could be a fun name for it. The idea of throwing a ball at something to knock them down goes way back. There's an old Hawaiian game called Ulu Makai, which is very similar to bowling, and due to this, I suggest popo as a new name for the sport, which is the Hawaiian word for ball, or just round or sphere in general. Finally, there's football. Football is a name used for a whole slew of sports across the world. We can't cover every kind of football here, so for ease's sake we will cover just two. The one that's popular in the USA where people throw an oval ball around with their hands, and the one that's popular in other parts of the world where you kick a ball around. While we could make up names for these two sports, they actually already have pretty well established alternative names that are more unique than just football. For the first kind of football I mentioned, known more as American football, we have the name of gridiron. This name derives from the fact that the markings of an American football pitch used to look like the iron grid used in cooking. This name of gridiron sounds pretty cool to me, so let's just go with that one. Then we have the other kind of football, known officially as association football. Now, as a Brit, it pains me to say this, but maybe we should just call it soccer. This name of soccer comes from a shortening of the aforementioned word of association. We have a whole video on the subject you can watch if you'd like. Calling these sports gridiron and soccer not only give them both unique names, but also resolves all the confusion between their names too. Now, once again, I need to stress, this really was just some silly nonsense. The names I devised are far from perfect, but what I hope you got out of this video is that we can follow etymology patterns of other words and apply them to different words too. If you hate any of the names I suggested, please feel free to suggest some other cool ideas down in the comments below. Now, if you don't mind me, I fancy a game of Knuffle, or maybe a few rounds of Popo. Name Explained depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/Name Explain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.